Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
President Trump remains in Scotland, where he's had a series of big meetings, meeting yesterday with the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, inking a trade deal and averting 30% tariffs being implemented on Friday, which of course is August 1st. The EU now facing a 15% tariff rate on basically all of its exports to the United States. And it's something that President Trump talked about today as he had another round of meetings with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who he's still with, in fact, as we speak, noting, of course, that the UK and the US had already reached a framework trade agreement much earlier on. Europe now next. Many other countries, though, are hoping they will be able to follow, knowing that Friday deadline is looming. Here's how the president talked about it earlier today.
We're making, great deals. We're making deals that are good for us, but we want them to be good for everybody. It's important. We're going to be setting a tariff for essentially the rest of the world, and that's what they're going to pay if they want to do business in the United States.
We go live to the White House right now for more. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, standing by with the latest from the North Lawn of the White House. Tyler, we're all looking ahead to Friday, of course, the 1st of August. But as Kayleigh mentions, there's another deadline, the 12th of August, when it comes to China, with tandem talks underway here with this White House. What comes next?
Right, exactly, Joe. And President Trump was asked about those talks with China earlier today, and he said, we're going to see what happens. Now, the USTR Jamieson Greer, in an interview earlier, gave us a little bit more color about what the White House is expecting when it comes to these discussions. He really amounted this to basically a check-in to make sure that both sides are upholding the agreement that was reached in London, which you'll recall was really to uphold the agreement reached in Geneva when it comes to some of those export controls around critical and rare earth minerals, as well as semiconductors and perhaps less advanced chips. Our reporting does indicate that China has started to ramp up its export licenses when it comes to rare earths, and we've also seen the U.S. starting to sort of loosen those restrictions, including NVIDIA's being able to sell its H20 chips into Beijing. The next phase here is really to make sure that the de-escalation continues. We are broadly expecting that they will extend this August 12th deadline. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said as much on Bloomberg television last week, August 12th, and then 90 days after that, because they seem to be doing this in 90-day increments. But there are a few threads where we could see potential progress here. The Treasury Secretary said that they would expand beyond export controls, and perhaps they would talk about curbing China's imports when it comes to sanctioned Russian oil, and then also importantly fentanyl, because Joe and Kayleigh, we have to keep in mind about 20% of that tariff that's currently in place against China is linked directly to the White House's concerns around fentanyl. While China has denied its role in its alleged role in fentanyl flows into the U.S., we did see them take some steps last week to curb 2 chemicals that are used in the opioid, perhaps seen as maybe a concession here to help keep talks going forward.
All right, so that's the talks with China, Tyler, and we'll see what the outcome of them ultimately is. Meanwhile, we know what the outcome of the meeting between Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission and President Trump's meeting was, which is that we have reached at least a framework of a trade deal. Some details we have now gotten from the White House. Walk us through it.
Right, exactly. And we have to keep in mind this is a really consequential deal for this White House just by sheer volume, Kayleigh, right? The EU makes up about 20% of U.S. annual imports into this country. So this was really something that ultimately was prioritized in these talks, despite at the beginning we were really told that the EU would be last in line for a deal. Now, our understanding is there's going to be that 15% baseline tariff, and it actually does include some really key sector-specific tariffs, including autos, about a $35 billion import industry from the EU to the U.S. That was a really critical area that the EU wanted to see some relief on, but it also extends to pharmaceuticals as well as chips. Really importantly to distinguish, though, we did get a fact sheet kicked out by the USTR Jamieson Greer's office just moments ago, which really does clarify that steel and aluminum tariffs will remain at 50% for now, but they do say that they are going to work on their supply chains and cooperation going forward, because our understanding from the EU side was that these metals would be tariffed under a lower level, under a certain quota, under a certain amount before it snapped back up to 50%. So we're still waiting for some key details there. But in order for the EU to clinch these lower rates, they did have to put in some sweeteners that include $600 billion worth of investment, as well as $750 billion pledge for U.S. energy. It's probably worth pointing out that the EU had been ramping up its imports of U.S. LNG already to account for steering away from Russian energy imports, for example. And then the last one I'll leave you two with is that President Trump says that the EU is going to start importing vast amounts of U.S. defense equipment. This is something that we were widely expecting, since we know that the U.S. has been calling on our European allies to boost their defense expenditures in the wake of the war with Ukraine.
Really interesting, Tyler. Just quickly, left wanting are European wine and spirits makers. They apparently decided to move this to another day to figure out what would happen to this very important industry for Europe. They're calling for a sector-specific carve-out here, an exemption. Do we have any sense of when that will be managed, when that'll be dealt with?
At this point, we're still awaiting details, but Joe, I know that you've spoken to quite a few European ambassadors about this exact issue, because this really is a huge industry for Europe. And you'll recall, actually, one of the first tariff threats against the European Union was against alcohol, wines, and spirits back before we even had the escalation to that 50% rate. So this is something that's really been a thread throughout and that we're going to have to watch very closely. But President Trump, as you mentioned, was asked about it earlier today.
You can always trust Joe Matthew to be on top of the wine story, and Tyler Kendall to be on top of everything out of the White House, where she reports for us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. And we want to get more into the actual detail of this trade agreement that has been reached with Europe, the trade agreements we have yet to see, and what it all means for companies that are actually trying to navigate this environment and figure out what it means for imports and exports. As we turn to Michelle Schultz, she's founder and managing partner of Schultz Trade Law and specializes essentially in helping corporations comply with things like this. Michelle, great to have you here on Balance of Power. When we consider even the deal that we've got with the European Union and the readout we now have, it really is broad strokes of a deal. We're missing a lot of granular detail here, and I wonder how corporations are dealing with that. Is this actually enough information to work with to make investment and purchasing decisions off of?
I do not believe it's exactly enough information to make decisions based off of, and we have already lost a lot of trust with our partners in the EU. Our clients are in different sectors like aerospace, oil and gas, food and wine, gourmet food, and they have been pivoting each time the tariffs get adjusted. We didn't expect this adjustment so soon, but we have to keep in mind that even though it's 15% on about 70% of the products, the tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper still apparently will be at 50%, and that includes derivatives. So when we're talking about details, I've got this book behind me. That's the harmonized tariff schedule. That is the perfect example of how detailed these rules get. Each item is listed in there. And so we need to check each item and see if it's subject to tariffs and how high.
Well, so what kind of conversations are you having with these clients that you mentioned? Because there seems to be a feel in Europe today, I don't know if this is the case in China, that while there are elements of this deal that are clearly favoring the United States, at last we have certainty when it comes to tariff levels. The fact that we might not like 15%, but at least we know it's 15%. Does that resonate with your clients?
It does, in the sense that it is one set number, but it's a little bit misleading because we have layers of different types of tariffs that are still going on, like the steel and aluminum tariffs. Also, all 27 countries within the EU have to sign off on this agreement, and I haven't seen them do that yet. In fact, I've seen a little bit of negative feedback from the Prime Minister of France and Hungary as well, I believe. So we're going to have to wait and see if all the EU members agree to this. It seems to me that Ursula von der Leyen was correct when she said this is essentially the best we're going to get. It's good, but it's not great. 15% across the board is still higher than we're used to. And I'm really hoping that this reduction will include 0% tariffs both ways on aircraft and aircraft parts, which has been mentioned, but we don't have anything in writing. We don't have a written agreement with that level of detail.
Yeah, there's a lot that we have yet to see pen actually put to paper on. Michelle, when we consider what the whole point of these tariffs are, yes, in part it's about balancing the trade deficit with the U.S., hence why Europe is agreeing to make more purchases of U.S. goods like military equipment and the like. But the president also contends that a lot of this is about onshoring supply as well. Are companies that you're speaking with finding the ability to do that very quickly, to replace supply that may come from somewhere else that they're currently importing and try to just get it domestically in the United States? How long does that process actually take to find those alternative routes if they're available at all?
If they're available at all, it takes a very long time. We have clients in every industry that are importing from virtually every major country in Europe, and it is not a fast process to find another supplier. Same with China. A lot of suppliers had already moved from China, so they moved to Vietnam, or the importer might have moved its manufacturer somewhere like Mexico when the very first China tariffs came out under Section 301 under President Biden. But then they had to pivot because now the Mexico tariffs are up. So what our clients are doing is pivoting as best they can and saving as best they can, but some of them will go out of business if tariffs continue to rise. And I think we have to remember that this is still an increase. It is not, it's a decrease from what was threatened, but it is still an overall increase in tariffs for everyone.
You mentioned the French Prime Minister, François Bayrou, on X, writing, "It's a dark day when an alliance of free peoples united to affirm their values and defend their interests resolves to submission." What's he talking about?
Oh, wow. Yes. So the Europeans were hoping for a lower tariff rate overall. They were hoping for a friendlier deal than we gave them, especially given our history with Europe. They had thrown out the number of 10% at one point, and I thought that maybe that would have been more reasonable in the eyes of the European countries, but they see 15% as still quite high and a slap in the face. It will impact trade, and it will be a cost to the U.S. importers. So it still presents a challenge, and it still presents an increase, and I think that some of the European leaders are disappointed.
Well, beyond the deal with just Europe, where I don't think I saw any mention of transshipping, Michelle, we have seen that mentioned in others, including the agreement that was reached with Vietnam, the idea that there would be even a higher tariff rate on transship goods that are coming in directly from China. I just wonder how hard that actually is to track and follow. How do we actually know where products are originating from if they're coming into the U.S. under cargo vessels with a different flag? How difficult is that, especially for importers, to try to navigate?
It's actually quite difficult. And we have been in the weeds of doing due diligence on suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers. And it's more and more difficult to the point where companies are using software tools. We have 3 at least that we're using right now in order to ferret out who owns what and who is sending what from where. But to determine that something is not made with slave labor, for example, in the Xinjiang region, we have to go way back into the supply chain. And you can't always rely on manufacturers' affidavits because they may or may not be true and correct. So you really have to go behind and do due diligence behind the paperwork. It's becoming more and more difficult. And I'll add that on the export side, the Commerce Department has been throwing around a 50% rule, similar to OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control's 50% rule, which would mean on the export side, we're also going to have to look at ownership, who owns what and what percentage. It's very difficult from a practical perspective.
We've got about a minute left. Michelle, how worried are you that this White House is too eager to reach deals, to announce deals to the markets and to others who were promised all of these amazing trade deals, too eager to follow up on the details that you're talking about, never mind make good on national security promises when it comes to high-tech chips?
I believe they can do it. I'm somewhat optimistic that they can do it, but it takes months, if not years, normally to negotiate a trade agreement. And so this is way out of line with your typical free trade agreement internationally. This is a deal, and it's really a deal in the sense of a deal. We've got some purchases that the European Union is going to make, and the details as far as which tariff numbers, what tariff codes, those aren't all clear yet. We still have steel and aluminum. I do think the White House has been a bit eager to show its success, and that's great. It's a step in the right direction, but I don't think that our allies and other countries are pleased with it quite yet.
Michelle, it's great to have you with us. Let's stay close on this. We have a lot more to talk about. Thanks for joining our conversation today. Michelle Schultz, founder, managing partner, Schultz Trade Law. Really interesting to get inside an operation that's dealing directly with the stakeholders.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Thanks for being with us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons, who's back with us today, I'm glad to say, as we talk politics here in the nation's capital. And it's not very often that a politician breaks through into the mainstream without spending a lot of money or doing something wrong. Case in point, James Talerico, a member of the Texas House of Representatives, a Democrat, a pastor, and a former teacher, is now being considered a potential threat to flip a Republican Senate seat blue, if he, of course, decides to run for it. Kaylee, this is an individual, I'll get personal here for a moment, who both of our spouses asked us about without prompt, unsolicited, which is something that never happens, by the way, in either of our homes. We don't really talk politics, right, when we go home at the kitchen table. But James Talerico was viral before he did the Joe Rogan interview, when he talked about the 10 Commandments in schools. Yep. He's a TikTok sensation. He's now apparently a Joe Rogan sensation. And a lot of smart people in Washington are asking if, in fact, he could be the future of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, in fact, Joe Rogan is hoping he might one day run for president.
Isn't that right?
Which is obviously an endorsement that would be highly coveted by many, as we know the influence Joe Rogan particularly has in politics, but especially as we consider what is a changing landscape in Texas with a redistricting fight underway with, as you mentioned, of course, a Senate seat potentially up for grabs. John Cornyn getting primaried by Ken Paxton. Many Democrats considering throwing their hats in the ring if they haven't done so already. Makes a unique moment in time to speak with Mr. Talerico.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. Which is why we reached out to James. Look at James Talerico in the act. I mentioned he's a pastor, talking about the confluence of his religious beliefs and politics. Listen on Bloomberg.
What would Jesus do about a tax system that benefits the rich over the poor? What would Jesus do about a healthcare system that forces the sick to start GoFundMe pages to afford life-saving surgeries? What would Jesus do about an education system that ties a child's school funding to their community's property wealth? Would he stay in his room and pray? Or would he walk into the seat of power and flip over the tables of injustice?
A taste of James Talerico's messaging, and he's joining us now on Bloomberg TV and radio for more. Appreciate the time, James. Thank you so much for being with us. What do you think it is about the way in which you are trying to convey what are, in some instances, political messages, leaning on your Christian faith and kind of biblical readings of policy issues that seems to be resonating in a way that other Democrats from Texas have struggled to see themselves resonate in recent years?
Well, thank you all for having me on, and please thank your spouses too for recommending me to you. I think people are hungry for authentic moral leadership in this country, and I think folks just want elected officials who are themselves and who are honest and speak directly and clearly. That's, I think, what this exposes. Folks are tired of the kind of consultant-driven, poll-tested political sound bites, and they want people who are just going to speak like a human being. And that's what I try to do every day, whether it's at a podium or a pulpit, whether it's as an elected official or as a member of the clergy.
Authentic moral leadership. Pastor Talerico makes you a contrarian in this political world, if not a unicorn, considering your background. We're in a world where sharp elbows work here in Washington, where the pressure play works, where bullying works, where name-calling is now considered commonplace, par for the course. A lot of people would ask how someone who considers themselves a man of God, someone who acts as a gentleman, has any place in this political world.
Well, one of my favorite verses in Scripture is Matthew 5:5, the meek shall inherit the earth, meaning, violence, bullying, aggression, those things may work in the short run. And I think that's what you're seeing in our political discourse. It gets you a temporary bump in your followers or in your cable TV viewership, or maybe even gets you elected in the next election. But it doesn't work in the long run. In the long run, I think people want honesty, they want compassion, they want understanding. And so I'm placing my long-term bet on those values. I honestly think over the last 10 years of our politics, people are just sick of the blood sport, and they're sick of the way that politics feels like professional wrestling a lot of the times. And I'm hoping that earnestness and sincerity are going to make a comeback in our politics. At least I hope so.
Well, and it's one thing to consider our politics along party lines and partisan divides, but there are also deep divides within the parties themselves. You need look no further than Texas, as I'm sure you well know, if at the primary in the Republican on the Republican side for the Senate seat between Ken Paxton and the incumbent Senator Cornyn. Are you worried that, as you consider a potential Senate run yourself, that a Democratic primary could potentially be just as damaging?
I don't think it has to be. Primary elections can be a good thing, especially if both candidates go about it in a respectful way. It should be a contest of ideas. I think we saw in the last election the consequences of not having a competitive primary. Those primaries make us better as candidates and as a party. I think that's true on both sides of the aisle. I think elections are always a good thing. Competition in politics is always a good thing. And I'm hoping that's true in this upcoming primary here in Texas.
Well, are you thinking about running for Senate? Is that a real story? And what's going into your consideration if that's the case?
I am thinking about it, but if I'm being very honest with you, my entire focus is really on the special legislative session that's just been called here in Texas. I'm sure you've covered this, but the president has asked our governor, Greg Abbott, to find him 5 more congressional seats. He wants to redraw the political maps in the middle of the decade to try to protect his majority in the next election, regardless of how we all vote. And I think this is politics at its worst. Politicians picking their voters instead of voters picking their politicians. And so I'm doing everything I possibly can to stop this gerrymander from going through, to stop this power grab from going through. I was elected by my constituents here in Central Texas to fight for them at the state capitol. That's what I'm going to do before I start thinking about other elected positions.
Well, if you view that as politics as it's at its worst, would it be a mistake for blue states like California or New York to try to follow Texas's lead and reclaim some more seats for Democrats?
I think the idea of every state being gerrymandered is a terrible vision for this country. That said, I do know that you have to stand up to bullies. You can't just lie down and let them win. And so I do think that we need folks who are willing to match energy, but we cannot lose sight of the ultimate goal, and that is fair elections in every state, fair maps in every state. I mean, every single state in this country should have an independent, citizen-led redistricting commission that takes the power to draw these maps out of the hands of politicians and puts it into the hands of the people that we seek to represent. So while we need to stand up to folks who are trying to grab onto power, like the president is currently trying to do, we can't lose sight of the ultimate vision, which is making sure that every state has fair maps and fair representation for all Americans.
Will you join other Democrats in leaving the state from keeping the majority from doing this in Texas?
Well, we're in the minority as Democrats here in the Texas legislature. We've been in the minority for a long time. And so we've had to figure out how to use every tool in our toolbox, whether that's the rules, whether it's our platforms, or whether it is denying quorum. That's obviously a dramatic step, and it's one that shouldn't be taken lightly. We haven't even seen the maps here in Texas yet, and so I don't want to rush to any conclusions. But I will just tell you that I think it's fair to say that my Democratic colleagues and I are willing to do whatever it takes to stop this power grab and to protect the democratic process here in Texas and around the country. Because if President Trump succeeds with this power grab in Texas, I worry that he will do the same thing in every red state across the country, which would essentially rig the 2026 midterms. And so regardless of your party, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or an independent, none of us want politicians in Washington silencing our voices and rigging the next election.
We'd love to have you back, James Talerico. When are you planning to make up your mind for this Senate race?
Well, I'd love to come back. The special legislative session is going to last until the end of August. And that's assuming another one won't be called right after that. So as long as I'm being called to do my job as a state representative here in the state capitol, that's what I'm going to be doing. But once that's over, I'll be looking at how I can best continue my service. And that may include running for another office in 2026.
Yeah, let us know when you make up your mind. We want to continue our conversation with you. James Talerico, Texas House of Representatives, Democrat, who you've been hearing so much about. We thought we'd bring him to you here on Balance of Power.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Under the heat dome here in the Amtrak corridor from Washington to New York, it's going to be another sweltering week. Pretty good strategy, most people will admit, for Donald Trump to get out of the bubble, get overseas, get out of the way of the whole Epstein story. Let your lieutenants leave town. They're in Stockholm. Scott Bessent's talking to China, Howard Lutnick, and so forth. House lawmakers are gone, set to defend their record here from a summer of legislating when they hold town hall meetings, catch up with the family, do a little bit of fundraising, and then when they all come back, it'll be a big sprint to the government funding deadline on September 30th. And, they're already talking about a possible shutdown. We hear about it every day around here. So we take a break this week, and it allows us to have some bigger picture ideas, although let's not be mistaken. This is going to be a very busy week in Washington. While there aren't a lot of people around, the news is going to be flying. We don't only have trade deals coming from overseas here. We have a trade deadline to cap the week on Friday. That's August 1, right? This was the end of the road here when it comes to reciprocal tariffs. And that's why a lot of countries have been coming to the table. Of course, we had the EU over the weekend. The presidents in Scotland sat down with the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and had something to show for it. Here's Donald Trump from yesterday.
We've reached a deal. I think you were saying this is probably the biggest deal ever reached in any capacity.
We have a deal, and it's a big deal. It's a huge deal. It's 15% tariffs across the board, all inclusive.
I think it's the biggest deal ever made. Thank you very much. Congratulations.
The biggest deal ever made. A big deal, a huge deal, she said. She clearly knows how to talk to Donald Trump. But this was supposed to be the elusive deal, right? The EU, they weren't getting along. Now we've got, they both use the word deal, at least a framework agreement. Here's the thing, though. They did not figure out the wine. And we're going to have some time to explore this on the program this week. The wine tariffs. Remember, Donald Trump promised 200% on wine, champagne, and spirits coming from Europe. Some of us may have even bought cases of wine in advance of those tariffs taking hold, but they're still not there. And they did not agree on what the number would be today. So we have to come back around on the grape juice, and we will. Yeah, Ed, biggest deal ever made, said Donald Trump. Now, we talk about context a lot here on Bloomberg. That's what we offer you. That's why you tune in to the broadcast, other than to hang out with your friends here in Washington. And we're going to seek some context with the help of Christopher Smart, because it's not only the trade deals happening. We just hit that. We've got a lot of economic data this week. Yeah, we've got a jobs report coming, a new month on Friday, and a Fed meeting. Remembering, last time we met, Donald Trump and Jay Powell had hard hats on and that incredible display over at the Eccles building here in Washington. His news conference following the Fed meeting and following that event and the pressure from Donald Trump is going to be fascinating. Christopher Smart is founder and managing partner of our Growth Group, former special assistant to the president at the National Economic Council during the Obama administration. And indeed, when we seek context, we find it with the help of Christopher. It's great to see you, sir. Welcome back to Bloomberg. It's good to connect on a day like this because there's a lot we need to talk about. And I'm wondering what has your attention and what will be kind of the most important of the tent poles this week. We open with trade deals. We have a Fed meeting right in the middle, and we have the jobs report on Friday. Will these three combine to bring good news to this White House?
Well, I've got bigger questions on my mind. First of all, why is it that you and I are the only two people trapped in the Amtrak corridor on a week like this and everybody else is gone?
That's a great question.
My second question is, which one looks more uncomfortable in those pictures? Is it Jay Powell in his hard hat, or is it Ursula von der Leyen trying to talk about the hugest deal she's ever seen? But
these are good questions, Christopher Smart. I don't know if you have answers to either of them, but she clearly knew who was coming to town, right? Keir Starmer set the mold for this.
That's right. No, she was briefed, but it's clear that she's cut from a different cloth politically from the president in terms of personality and persona. But to your question, broader questions about the economy and the markets, I think, clearly the EU deal is helpful to have a framework, at least around which to work, but huge gaps in terms of understanding what will be included, what will be excluded. Steel apparently is included currently in this. I'm sorry, steel is not included in this, but there are ongoing talks around steel that may lead to an even lower rate for European steel. Pharmaceuticals are a big question. I know in the UK, the president being in Scotland right now, Scotch whiskey is a big question mark in terms of what tariffs that will be facing coming into the US, in addition to the wine that you covered. But broadly speaking, I think it's important to know that we do know more about what the trade framework is going to look like than we did a couple of months ago. And tariffs that were roughly around 2% of as a weighted average tariffs for United States imports are now going to be just below 20% if the current trajectory continues. So I think that's the big headline that we all need to kind of absorb. And that's probably what the Fed is still going to look at as it gathers later this week to decide not to change rates. And I guess the bigger question is, will there be dissents to that decision?
Well, it's fascinating here. What do you make of this idea that when we consider the uncertainty that the Fed's going to be clearly addressing on Wednesday, that investors are kind of ignoring at the moment, this idea that, well, we don't have all the details and, it may not be as favorable to the EU as Ursula von der Leyen was hoping, but you know what? At least we know what the tariff level is. And having that certainty may be the most valuable part of these negotiations, Christopher.
Well, it is, but again, the certainty is only relative. So it's certainly much better than we have had in the last few months. But again, lots of companies that make decisions about where to build the factory, about what supply lines to build, really need to know the details. Need to know what the exclusions are, not only how is it applying to them, but how is it going to apply to their suppliers, to their customers? How is it going to apply to their competitors? Just as a small example right now, we had the Japan deal over the weekend. We now have an EU deal. The big, we're now importing cars from Mexico and Canada outside of USMCA at much higher rates than the UK and than the UK, the EU, and Japan. So all of these are interconnecting parts that will have to be addressed going forward. That means that for certainty, we're still going to have to wait a long time. I guess the good news to your earlier question about the economic data we're getting is that the economic data still seems to be pretty good, and the economy seems to be resilient to some of these headwinds.
Well, what do you make of the message from the administration, Christopher? Like, hey, you guys have been telling us every month since we showed up here that tariffs are going to cause inflation. It hasn't happened yet. And if it hasn't happened yet, then why would it happen? The idea being that we're somehow out of the woods here. But what happens if it kicks in the second half, maybe in the third or fourth quarter, Christopher? We are having a very different conversation about the impact of tariffs on our economy and prices.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I think if you were on the FOMC looking at just the economic data, not looking at anything to do with trade policy, you would probably be thinking about a couple of cuts right now. Because of the way the interest rate, because of the way prices have been falling, not as fast as you'd like them to, but they're certainly heading downward for the most part. But then you add on to that uncertainty around what the president's deals will be. Now that's becoming clearer right now, and as I said, we're moving from a world of 2% to roughly 20%. The president and others would say that's just a one-off. That's only affecting 10% of our imports. 10% of GDP, which are what our imports represent. But the third element to all of this is, yes, but how do others respond to these tariffs, right? You certainly have domestic producers that are going to raise their rates, their prices to meet the prices of the importers. You have other countries that are going to respond in one way or another with some kinds of tariffs. And then you've got the uncertainty around the broader tariff structure going on into the next few months and years. And it's not necessarily that tariffs themselves drive inflation. It's trade wars and trade uncertainty that drives inflation.
Well, Donald Trump's feeling pretty good about things at the moment, Christopher. I suspect that anybody would with a trip like this. He's playing golf. I guess he's playing pretty good golf out there. Did you see, by the way, Golf Force One? I don't know if you have one of these, Christopher, but they've made like this bulletproof golf cart for him. It appears to be, according to reporting, a modified Polaris Ranger XP. Imagine a golf cart with, the armor and the tint, the windows around. He's got this massive entourage on the golf course. I don't know. It looks like the Gator that I ride around in when I visit my buddy Adam in Orange. But
I'm sure it's
either way,
it's probably a gift from the people of Scotland.
You think it came from? It's a donation to the Air Force.
Exactly.
But look, if you're Donald Trump, Christopher Smart, you're sitting there saying, I'm surrounded by naysayers and I keep announcing deals. And I just wonder your message to the casual observer. What would you tell our viewers or listeners who are saying, boy, seems like tariffs work pretty well?
Yeah. No, and I think that's a fair question to ask. And I think, you've seen concessions, right, on the part of some of these countries. I think some of them are being exaggerated. For example, the commitments to invest in the U.S., to buy things from the U.S., those were going to happen probably in any case. Europe needs to diversify its energy supply. It needs to buy more defense, for its own defense. So those were going to happen anyway. On the other hand, you see commitments to open up the markets to U.S. companies. And those are things that are very difficult. They're very easy to promise, very difficult to do. It involves layers and layers of regional regulation, legal reforms, lots of things that we'll only see the results of, whether they work or not, in over many years. But again, I just go back to the uncertainty. Trade deals aren't necessarily deals themselves that you strike and sign a piece of paper. They're setting the framework for an ongoing relationship as things change. And if that relationship isn't clear and predictable, it becomes very difficult to do business.
Fascinating, as always. Christopher Smart, our Broth Group. We always look forward to the conversation, Christopher. I feel like I could picture you in a Golf Force One on the Boston Common. We got to follow up on this. Much more ahead on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
President Trump earlier this month had given a 50-day deadline, which would bring us at that point into early September, for Vladimir Putin to reach a ceasefire deal with Ukraine, or else face the threat of secondary sanctions or tariffs. And today, while he was sitting down with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, President Trump announced he's set to bring that deadline forward.
I'm going to make a new deadline of about 10 or 12 days from today. There's no reason in waiting. There's no reason in waiting. It's 50 days. I want to be generous, but we just don't see any progress being made. It would be sanctions and maybe tariffs, secondary tariffs.
This is the undercurrent of the conversations on trade that the president is having overseas. You can add Gaza to that list as well as we assemble our political panel. They're both with us today, Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis. Rick is our Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie is Senior Democracy Fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, this is an interesting turn here and fascinating to listen to the language coming from President Trump just a day after he met with Ursula von der Leyen and now today with the UK's Keir Starmer. Is this trip to Scotland the worst thing that could have happened to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think the worst thing that could have happened to Vladimir Putin is Vladimir Putin. Remember, he's gone through other presidents, sort of rinse and repeat, right? He thinks you're going to be your best friend. You're going to have a strategic relationship finally with the former Soviet Union, only to be disappointed by the fact that he actually has no intention of being anything other than a former KGB agent who's out to recreate the, Russian Empire. Remember, George W. Bush once said, "Oh, I look in his eyes and I saw, somebody I could deal with," and that's the same experience Donald Trump's had. He looked into his eyes and he thought he was someone he could do business with, and now he's realizing the same thing George W. realized and Barack Obama and other former presidents. You can't do business with this man. He has an agenda that is counter to the global agenda of freedom and democracy and trade. And where do you find common ground? There is none. And that's what Donald Trump is now realizing. So the fact that he's in the embrace of the Europeans, that's helpful, right? Keir Starmer will make a good effort on the airplane flying to the Aberdeen golf course today to say that guy's a bad guy and we ought to shut him down. So that's good. The question is, does it stick when he's home and he's surrounded by other sort of MAGA Kremlinites who are going to give him a different tune? With Donald Trump, so many times it's the last man in the office. And maybe Keir Starmer should spend more time in Washington.
Well, building on Rick's point, Jeannie, and thinking back to the language we just heard from President Trump, the suggestion that there is no reason for waiting for a longer deadline, suggesting that the outcome might not be different, whether the wait period is 50 days or 10 days. Is this a President Trump that is now resigned to the idea that he can't deal with Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, and I think the question is, why has it taken him so long? Donald Trump is the one who gave Vladimir Putin this long runway, and he continually goes on television and talks about, even today in his press conference, the nice, pleasant calls they'll have. And then 3 hours later, Vladimir Putin is bombing Kyiv. The reality is the person who hasn't changed their note or tune at all is Vladimir Putin. He's been clear from the beginning on what he will and will not accept. And that has not changed. And so I'm not sure why Donald Trump has been fooling himself, quite frankly, that something would change if he gave him 50 days or 10 days. I think what's troubling policy-wise is the president is talking about these secondary sanctions. And a big question about those is those aren't going to be sanctions on Russia. They'll be sanctions on people who do business with Russia, including India and China, the very people we're trying to have a trade deal with. So I'm not sure that gets him where he wants to go either. And I think what it says is he doesn't want to take the next step of firmly standing behind Ukraine and giving them what they need to execute this war. And if he's not prepared to do that, and I understand why, then all of this is for naught.
What's your thought on that, Rick? We've been talking about secondary sanctions, the four of us now, for years. Will the Trump administration be the one to put them in effect?
Very well could, and it's about time. As you point out, this hasn't been a hard one to figure out. It's not doing trade with China and India that matters. It's the revenue that Russia gets that sustains their war effort from doing those trade deals. And so if you have an ability to shut that down, you have ability to help shut down the war effort in Russia. And by the way, either Donald Trump's going to do it at what his level he said is 100% tariff costs, or the Congress is going to pass overwhelmingly a tariff regime, a sanctions regime, where those tariffs are 500%. And so I think it's a lock to say something's going to happen where economic sanctions on Russia get a lot stiffer, pretty soon. And either Donald Trump's going to do it or Congress is going to do it and put it on his desk and dare him not to sign it.
Well, of course, as President Trump is pushing for an end to this war, he also is pushing for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas as the world is growing increasingly focused on the hunger that the people of Gaza are currently experiencing and questions over whether or not that classifies as starvation. To ask the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, if it does, his answer is no. This is what he said yesterday.
Israel is presented as though we are applying a campaign of starvation in Gaza. What a bold-faced lie. There is no policy of starvation in Gaza, and there is no starvation in Gaza. We enable humanitarian aid throughout the duration of the war to enter Gaza. Otherwise, there would be no Gazans.
And while he says there is no campaign of starvation, others obviously beg to differ, including, it seems, President Trump, who was actually asked about the situation in Gaza alongside the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who described the people of Britain specifically as being revolted by the images they are seeing out of Gaza. Trump suggested he's seen the pictures too, and he does not agree with Netanyahu. This is what he said.
The United States will be helping with the food. You know, we have a lot of access to food. We got a lot of food ourselves. And we're going to bring it over there. We're also going to make sure that they don't have barriers stopping people. We're going to be getting some good, strong food. We can save a lot of people. I mean, some of those kids that's real starvation stuff. I see it. And you can't fake that. So we're going to be even more involved.
Real starvation stuff, Jeannie, that you can't fake. What do we make of this break between President Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister?
I think it was very welcome that the president broke with the prime minister. As you mentioned, we've all seen the pictures, despite in many cases the press not being welcome into Gaza. We've been able to see pictures. And I think one of the most horrific stories we heard this weekend was a 5-month-old baby who died weighing less than when she was born. This came out of the AP. And Donald Trump said it absolutely right, President Trump, that the pictures don't lie. And so I think it's very important that the president said that. I don't know where that leaves us. We've seen Israel put in a corner where it's opening some food corridors. It's allowing a pause in the fighting for there to be some movement forward in terms of the aid. But we are, quite frankly, no closer to a real end to this war from either side. And as these people starve to death, 60,000 dead over there, that is a very troubling sign. But I was glad the president today said that, and he said it loud, and he said it so the entire world could hear what we all know to be the truth.
Rick, what do you make of the rhetoric from Netanyahu's government, from Benjamin Netanyahu himself, Ron Dermer, and others, that what we're seeing, I mean, you heard Netanyahu, they're saying there is no starvation in Gaza. They're actually going a step further to say that Hamas is exploiting young children with terminal diseases and having them photographed to make it look as if they are starving. How are Americans supposed to interpret this messaging?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, all of those things could be true, and yet the truth is also on the side of the people of Gaza who are hungry. I mean, I take my lead from Cindy McCain, the World Food Program head. Wouldn't surprise anybody that I'd say that, but the reality is there are independent agencies that do this all across the world, and they know a famine, they know starvation when they see it. They've been very outspoken about this. You would think that Prime Minister Netanyahu would use them as a safe place. As long as they're happy, he will have some insulation to the criticism of what he's doing in Gaza. But the reality is there are a lot of voices in the Israeli government right now. We have to assume that the voice that matters the most is Bibi Netanyahu's, and it seems out of step with what the rest of the world, the World Food Program, and others who are charged with avoiding this kind of situation are saying about the access points, the amount of food that's getting in there, and the distribution process that's being used. It's a failure by anybody's stretch of the imagination. And the fact that now Donald Trump has an inclination to do something about it, his close relationship with Bibi hopefully can be put to use so that so that the efforts to combat Hamas aren't cast in a negative light because of the dire situation that the rest of the people of Gaza have actually been exposed to.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our political panel on this Monday. Thank you so much, covering all things geopolitics.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.